I'm Henry Bonsu and this is Doubling Down, where every week we tackle a topic that got you talking on social media and beyond. Joining me today are Dr Tony Sewell, the founder of education charity Generating Genius, Dr Zubaida Haque, Deputy Director of the Runnymede Trust, Britain's leading race equality think tank, and the author and blogger Trevor Phillips. Welcome to all of you. Very good to see you here. Now, it's been in the French Constitution for over 70 years, but now lawmakers have voted to remove the word race from their cherished document. It was inserted in 1946 to show people that the state would no longer tolerate racist ideas propagated by the Nazis and their French collaborators. Well, President Macron has now agreed with politicians lobbying from French overseas territories in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean that the word should be removed. Some observers, like former President Nicolas Sarkozy, do not agree. He said, if we delete the word racism, does this mean that it will no longer exist? This is absurd. Their split reflects the divide in France and other continental European countries about how exactly to tackle racism. The debate raises serious questions about patriotism, ethnicity and inclusion too, and it's one that most countries have failed to resolve. So panel, the actual text of the Constitution reads at the moment, France shall be an indivisible, secular, democratic and social republic. It shall ensure the equality of all citizens before the law, without distinction of origin, race or religion. Tony, coming to you first. Is this a step in the right direction?
I think it's a step in the right direction, but usually, and I hate to say this, things French tend to be a little bit absurd at times. They use the word absurd.
Well, we have the theatre of the absurd.
In more ways than one. Okay. And I think that one of the absurdities of it is that people will still hang on to these notions of race anyway, even irrespective of what the government say. However, I kind of like the idea, being a disruptor myself, yes, of making sure that certainly for the universities and also for those people who are now indulged in identity politics, yeah, if we dissolve the word race, then we might have to think of something else to argue about.
Well, they're taking out the word race and putting gender instead, well, because they think that's more important now.
Well, yeah, and I think that probably gender will go as well, you know, eventually. But I do think that specifically around the issue of race, that in fact, one of the problems is it's two absurdities in a way. It's an absurdity to try and dissolve this thing as if France can say now we're raceless, yeah, and we know that that's not the case. However, on the other hand, I do think there's something in sending a signal, particularly to the university world, that really and truly, you know, some of your politics around race is so absurd that we might as well get rid of it because it's not taking us anywhere.
Zubaida, you're somebody who has inhabited the university space, but you're now helping to lead a think tank. We often hear that race isn't a biological reality, it's just a social construct. I keep hearing this all the time. So by removing it from the French Constitution, surely the state, La République, is acknowledging that people cannot be differentiated by their genes. Fair enough?
Yes, except it's always been a social construct. You know, I mean, just because the race is race when it began was a biological difference, I don't think we should be naive about the fact that it's always had social connotations. You know, people from centuries ago used to look at black people and used to criminalize black people, used to over-sexualize black people. I mean, those connotations haven't gone. Those connotations still very much in existence. So,
but the French are saying it's wrong to call it racial. It's something different. It might be ethnic or cultural, but not race.
But did you get rid of racism by removing the term race? I mean, it's a disingenuous debate. And actually, I think the biggest issue here, is they've got the wrong answer to the right question. And the right question is, how can we achieve equality between different groups, regardless of racial backgrounds? That's the right question. But to remove race from that, to remove race is basically saying, well, therefore we'll get rid of racism. So it is a very...
That was a Sarkozy argument, which is rather ironic given that he's centre-right. And he also said this, Richard, he said it would be an insult to all the French Jews who died at the hands of the Nazis. That was when it was mooted by former President Hollande during the election campaign of 2012. Do you think that's fair, that criticism?
I mean, I can see the point of this in that, I mean, the word is now going to be about origin, gender, and what's the last category I've forgotten?
I think it's about... let's have a look.
No, it isn't.
No, the indivisible secular. So distinction of origin, and it will now be gender or religion.
Yeah, gender, origin.
Well, yeah, I mean, basically... I think the point about origin, in a way, I feel it all ought to be, you know, the religious part of it all also to be condensed into origin, if you like. I suppose there is a difference, but essentially what they're saying is racism, in the sense that we've come to understand it, which apparently was not, by the way, the original meaning of what race was about. It was about a thing about language originally, and it got sort of metamorphosed into this thing, the identity. But we've come to think of it in terms of, you know, Caucasians and
Africa,
whatever, you know. And we know that these are ridiculously superficial differences and basically discredited in terms of meaning anything, in terms of differences between people, and it is a matter of origin. So in a way, I think it's a good thing. It's obviously not going to stop otherism, which is really the point of this, because where anti-Semitism and and Islamophobia and as we call it racism morphs together, is that it's otherism. It's a rejection of other people and a demonization of other people, isn't it? And it's just otherism. And I think in a way it's a good thing to look at it like this.
I mean, this is something that's pretty critical for the French state right now, Zubaida, given what's happened in the last few years with extremism attacks and the rise of the far right.
Yes, but I wonder if there's a lot more going on here than the actual philosophical and moral debate, because in a way that seems to be the pretext, you know, which is, look, you know, race, as you say, you know, citizenship is indivisible. We don't believe in racial differences, so let's get rid of the term. But what we have to understand is this debate's been going on for a long time.
Yes.
What we also have to understand is in the context of populism, you know, this whole issue of othering, it isn't an accident, I don't think, that they replaced race with gender. I mean, in many ways, I do believe that they've weaponized gender against race. There is this divide and
we
rule
may come back to
politics
this in just a moment or two. We haven't managed to work out what's going on in the French mind, but we have on the line somebody who must know. That's right, because he is Trevor Phillips, the former chairman of the Commission for Equality and Human Rights. He was given a Légion d'honneur by the French government for his work on race and diversity. Trevor, welcome to the programme.
Hi there, Henry.
Hi. Now, what do you make of this decision to dump race from the Constitution? Do you think it's well-meaning but naive, or inspired?
Well, I think it's typically French, isn't it? It's a wonderful argument between les philosophes français about something that is frankly meaningless. You can replace race with origins, but let's just get down to brass tacks. When they shot the guy the other day in the suburbs of Paris, when the police shot him, nobody said, "What's your origin?" They looked at him, he looked brown, he's a different race. They shot him. That's the reality. So I think that, in truth, this is a bit of a misdirection on Macron's part. And it's a great piece of theatre, but it's actually meaningless. I'm frankly with Sarkozy here. What Sarkozy wanted to try to do when he was president was to persuade the Assemblée Nationale to allow the government to compile statistics on education, employment, and so on by race. Because of the history with the Nazis and Jews and so on, France, like Germany, like the Netherlands, like most of the rest of the EU, thinks that collecting data based on differences by race or ethnicity is somehow reminiscent of what happened 70 years ago. As a consequence, they don't have any data on success or failure, racial difference or racial inequality. And to me, that is 100 times more important than this kind of slightly nonsensical debate.
You say it's slightly nonsensical, Trevor, and you say that, you know, the French have been persuaded or Macron has been persuaded, but it's important to understand that it's French Caribbean and French Indian politicians in the overseas dependent territories, Département d'Outre-mer, so we're talking Martinique, Guadeloupe, Réunion, who've been lobbying for this move. Why do you think they've been lobbying for it then?
Because they're clever French people who live in their heads. They don't really have much to say about what's really happening. I mean, if I can just be very, very, very concrete about this question of race, it's fine for people like us to say, oh, race is a kind of artificial construct and all the rest of it. Let's just get grounded here. My father died partly because there's sickle cell in my family. That is a condition that is peculiar to people of my racial background. Try telling anybody in my family that race does not exist.
Well, you called it your racial background. I mean, my dad died last year of prostate cancer. Men of African origin and the diaspora are far more likely to die of prostate cancer than men of white European origin.
Correct.
I could say, well, it's not about race, it's about his origin, his culture. You think I should still be calling it racial background?
Well, because that's what we mean by race. You know, we can. I'm sure that we can have a really learned conversation about the significance of what proportion of DNA divides somebody of an African background from an Eastern European background. You know, I know all about that. But the truth is, in popular usage, in the terms that most people talk about the world today, race has a meaning.
All right, Trevor. I want to ask you one more thing, Trevor.
Last point, Henry.
Yeah.
The last person who tried to do this was Fidel Castro, who in 1961 said that because the revolution had happened, race had been abolished. And literally, the Cuban constitution has no reference to race. However, Cubans have 7 different words for gradations of color.
Yeah.
So you can have all the constitutional finagling you like, but you have to deal with where people heads really are at.
Okay, Trevor, one more question. I'm just thinking about the advice you gave them on how to forge a cohesive national identity. They must have appreciated it because they made you a Légion d'honneur. What advice did you give them, and why is it that they're still struggling on identity right now?
Well, the main point I made to them at that stage was, first of all, that they needed to do something about the geography, because the big problem they had was car burning by people who lived in the banlieue, the estates that surround big French cities, with the exception of Marseille. And the first point I made was that they really had to make concrete efforts. If they couldn't get people off those estates, they needed to find ways of including them, giving them opportunities for jobs, and so on. And the second thing that they had to do was to focus on getting the police, the French police, not to be so absolutely bigoted and racist in just tiny ways towards young people of North African background. And third thing I said, you need to show that you understand the disadvantage that these young people are facing. And that means you've got to collect statistics. Sarkozy, to his credit, acted on the first 2. And he tried to do something on the third. But interestingly, though he got the National Assembly to agree, the French have a thing called the Constitutional Council, which is sort of like our Privy Council, only more powerful, that can rule that a piece of legislation passed by the Parliament is unconstitutional. And they struck down the decision by the Parliament to collect statistics on racial equality as unconstitutional. So today, the French can't tell you whether black people are more or less likely to be employed, more or less likely to get into university, and so on. And that, to me, is a much more shocking thing than, you know, a sort of philosophical debate about whether race exists or not.
Trevor Phillips, Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Merci, au revoir, à bientôt.
Okay, à bientôt. Well, I will come to you in a moment, panel, but as ever, our viewers are happy to share their thoughts on social media, and here's a sample of what's out there on Twitter. And we'll start off with Gregory, who says, "Not a moment too soon. The word race has been eliminated from the French Constitution. Now it simply remains to eliminate racism. Not so easy." Then we have this from Shuvik, who says, "I am very concerned that President Macron wishes to remove a constitutional commitment to racial equality in France. Race relations are bad there now, and the extreme right is once more a dangerous political force." And here's what you've been saying on Facebook, and we'll start off with Leonid, who says, "Unfortunately, race does exist, and no constitutional change will alter this fact." And finally, Io says, "I understand the sentiment behind this move. The only race is a human race. However, as a policy, it feels incredibly naive." Now remember, you can always get involved in the conversation on Twitter, Facebook or Instagram by using the handle Doubling Down TV. Okay, Zubaida, now, unlike us, the French, they don't want to gather data and statistics. They prefer the assimilationist model rather than the multicultural model. And as Trevor was saying, it's still illegal to collect data on race, ethnicity, or religion. The Republic says it's colourblind. What do you think the impact is that it's had on French society, or even German society, or Swedish society?
Well, yes. I mean, I think colourblind is really a euphemism for we're going to bury our heads in the sand. Trevor Phillips had made the very good point that actually what really matters is the lived experience of black and ethnic minority people in France. And it's something that they're completely denying. Like, if you don't collect the statistics, you don't know who's experiencing what, how and where. It's really basic questions. Trevor mentioned health. You talked about health outcomes. But actually, it goes beyond that. What we're talking about are people's life chances going beyond health. Employment. We know from anecdotal surveys, for instance, academic surveys, that even in employment, that if you have an African sounding name, a North African sounding name, or a Muslim name, you're less likely to be called for an interview. We know, of course, from the police that they are more likely to stop and search black young men. I've been
stopped and searched far more as a young person of African origin in Paris than I ever have in London or Manchester.
So you have to ask yourself, why aren't they having those debates? Why aren't there concrete policies to address that? Now, I do think it's important. We have to think about the social context. We have to think about the fact that Marine Le Pen got something like, what, a third of the vote on an anti-immigrant platform. And that anti-immigrant platform are not the Spanish, and not the Italians. They're not worried about the local European. They're worried about the racialised
Muslim, the West
black
African.
and brown and Muslim faces.
Richard?
Well, you see, the problem with the collecting of the statistics is that they can be used, to whatever, in whichever way you want to use them, and there will be people on the other side of the argument who will use them in completely the other way. They will point, for instance, to the number of, whatever it happens to be, who aren't, the number of, well, here's a simple example. If you can argue, some people will argue the number of Jews, I am a Jew, by the way, that the number of Jews who are, Nobel Prize winners, if they want to look at it that way, because it's, disproportionately high. Others arguing on the other side will point to the number of Jews running, involved in high positions in the media. And you can interpret these figures depending on which way you want to. And that's the danger of it. I'm not arguing...
But we shouldn't be afraid of figures for that reason. Because at the same time, the positives of those figures is you can say, yes, discrimination does exist. It exists here, it exists with this number of people, and it exists in this ways, and that's why you need a policy in this specific way to address the problem.
Tony, where are you on the issue of data collection?
I think data collection is interesting.
Education, health, whatever.
I mean, there is some interesting ways of looking at the data. This is different than this. I mean, for example, what I find quite interesting is that if you flip it in some ways, let me give you one. I can really continue an example from the UK. I don't know the French situation well enough, but Imperial College, for example, has a disproportionate amount of, say, for example, Asian males on the campus. Yeah. So
these are students, not just wandering around the place.
No, just not just there. So, but then you could argue that there's a disproportionate amount of, say, for example, males from, or females from that, who were born in Britain of a black origin. Of a black, or not just foreign students here. Now, that's an interesting data, because you see, the issue then is, what do you, and I think Rich is making a point, the notion of almost, what's the motive behind the data collection? You know what I mean? And do we
to see whether or not people are present as a proportion, or in a reasonable proportion compared to their presence in the country as a whole.
Yeah, but we've never, you see, this is quite interesting. For a long time we knew in the education community that white children were actually underachieving worse than any other group. But we didn't collect that particular data, because what we were doing, we went for very crude ways of collecting. And our real motive for collecting was in the end, just to keep showing that this black underachievement thing persisted. And yet Now this white underachievement just didn't come from nowhere. You know? It was always sitting there.
Yes, but statistics have allowed us to now figure out with white working class students. Sorry, I'll do this. With white working class, we've now figured out that it's not all white students that are failing. It's free school meals. So the advantage of statistics is you can really identify the problem.
Before you guys run off with this, we've moved from France, we've moved across the channel to Britain. And we will discuss Britain in much more detail. But first, I mean, the decision to remove the word race passed without much comment in France. But of course, it did provoke a reaction in this country, with some commentators mocking President Macron for trying to abolish race. And it's no wonder eyebrows were raised in this country because, as you may have heard, for the last few decades, the tradition here has been to acknowledge and respect ethnic and cultural differences between the various groups that make up society. It's also what they've done in the USA from the highest level downwards.
It means we believe in a union not just between the nations of the United Kingdom, but between all of our citizens, every one of us, whoever we are and wherever we're from. That means fighting against the burning injustice that if you're born poor, you will die on average 9 years earlier than others. If you're black, you're treated more harshly by the criminal justice system than if you're white. If you're a white working class boy, you're less likely than anybody else in Britain to go to university.
It doesn't matter who you are, or where you come from, or what you look like, or where you love. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white, or Hispanic, or Asian, or Native American, or young or old, or rich or poor, able, disabled, gay or straight. You can make it here in America if you're willing to try.
President Obama in vintage form in 2016 and Theresa May, the British Prime Minister. Sorry, President Obama was in 2012 and Theresa May was in 2016. See, things have changed so much, I've forgotten who was...
It looks like ancient history, doesn't
it? I know it does. So, panel, look...
sorry, Henry, just to answer one point that Tony made, I just want to ask you. He said this point about, for a long time, it was seen that in order to advance the case that young black boys weren't getting the attention they deserve, that was the perception that was allowed to continue because they weren't measuring the performance of white. Now, did it help the perception of black people to have that misapprehension there? Did it help people by profiling them in that way, or did it just
the constant deluge of black boys
did it just underpin the idea they weren't as capable?
It's not the statistics that are doing the profiling, it's people that are doing the profiling. I mean, we have to get back to the discrimination here. Like, the statistics are just a way of saying, yes, we've got discrimination, but where is it? How big is it? How do we address it? The fact, what we keep getting away from here, and actually what Macron is getting away from, is that the discrimination exists, but right now there are no tools, there are no policies to combat that discrimination.
Before Tony comes back in, the reason why we played you those clips of President Obama and Theresa May, British Prime Minister, is we've had this race audit, race disparity audit here in this country published in October last year. It showed that for all our years of the multicultural model, you know, celebrating difference and treating people according to where they've come from, background, we are still hopelessly divided in this country. So do we have any right to lecture the French if they want to abolish the term race from their constitution?
Well, wait a minute. I've just gone through some of that audit. And this is what I'm trying to say, that it's the data, and it is about people, because in the end, people drive the politics around that data. So, for example, one of the interesting things about the data is that, in fact, black Caribbean and black African now, in terms of university entry, it's the highest performing group. The worst performing groups are white working class people. So, I mean, that's a massive change from when I went to university, when you went. What we never get in the narrative, in the politics, and this is where it really matters, if we talk about real politics, let's go French here, is that...
or the Deutsch.
Yeah, or Deutsch.
German.
Is that you never get the narrative, the story of the positive, and you never get the story of where the progress is.
A positive story...
That's not fair. There will be progress.
We haven't got long left. Zubaida, respond to that.
So, Tony, there's a difference between saying more people than ever before from black communities are getting into higher education. great, absolutely. You
No,
know, we
compared
should
to other
celebrate.
groups.
No, no,
No, compared to other
okay,
groups.
there's a difference to saying that more people getting in. Firstly, more people should be getting in because when you look at the population, there are more black young people than ever before. So yes, we celebrate the fact that we're getting in, but the problem is, and this is where the statistics comes in, is when you look at the statistics, you can, for instance, see, and this is happening a lot with
very,
Oxbridge
very short
at the
time,
moment,
30 seconds left.
you can, for instance, see that 400 black people are applying, yet only 2 are getting in.
Tony.
And that,
I mean, look. The data is showing in terms of again, what's been said here is quite interesting, and this is where even America's been locked in the sense that sometimes you can run with the data, and it's almost like you get what you want to see in that data,
Yeah.
and if you want to see the positive and run with that, then it's there. And if you want to see the negative, which we more or less, that's what we tend to do in our policy,
But
you
let's
get the
not
negative.
We
the
started off on
messenger,
race,
isn't it?
and we've ended up on data, statistics,
But
and
it's
probably
shooting the
analytics.
messenger. That's the point. And
I
it's
wish
the
we had
same
more
with the
time,
race
but you know what?
construct.
We don't. We've run out of time. Sorry, we've got to finish. That's it for this week. Oh, I wish we had so much more. Thanks very much to my studio guests, Richard Phillips, Dr Zubaida Haque and Dr Tony Sewell. For news of next week's topic and to get your views in early, check out Doubling Down on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.